Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when the world feels unbearably heavy, when the patterns we follow seem endless, and when our desires, our cravings, our very addictions feel like chains we cannot break. Yet, within these struggles lies a subtle, almost sacred message, a whisper from existence itself, guiding those who are willing to listen. Addiction, in all its forms, is not merely a curse or a weakness. It is a mirror, reflecting the parts of ourselves we often refuse to see, the depths of our longing, the corners of our soul that are untouched by ordinary understanding. And every urge, every compulsion carries with it a lesson, a revelation, waiting for the one ready to awaken. It is in the surrender to these forces, not in blind resistance, that insight emerges, revealing the hidden architecture of our consciousness and the truths that are otherwise invisible. And here, the ordinary meets the extraordinary, and the struggle itself becomes a dialogue with the divine, a conversation where even our darkest impulses can become teachers, pointing us toward a clarity that cannot be reached through logic alone. Addiction is often seen as a flaw, a weakness, something to be hidden or conquered, yet in reality, it functions as a mirror. It reflects not what the world wants us to be, but what we truly are beneath the layers of distraction and pretense. Every habit we cling to, every desire we chase relentlessly, exposes the corners of our mind and spirit that are most neglected, most misunderstood. These impulses are not random. They emerge from the depths of our consciousness, carrying with them insights we might otherwise never encounter. When a person recognizes the patterns of their compulsions, they begin to see the contours of their inner landscape, the fears they deny, the longings they suppress, the emptiness they attempt to fill with fleeting pleasures. Addiction is a language, subtle and precise, spoken not through words, but through repeated actions, impulses, and cravings. To observe it is to begin reading the script of one's own psyche, to understand what the soul seeks when the mind is silent. Those who attempt to ignore or shame their compulsions often remain trapped, unable to see the reflections clearly, mistaking the symptom for the self. Yet when approached with curiosity rather than judgment, each craving becomes a teacher, each moment of craving a doorway into self-knowledge. The intensity of desire, the frustration of resistance, and the fleeting satisfaction of indulgence all reveal the invisible structures that govern thought and feeling. The mirror of addiction shows what is usually hidden, the raw, unprocessed emotions, the unmet needs, and the unresolved conflicts that shape behavior. By observing without denial, by seeing clearly what lies behind the urge, one begins to discern patterns that are otherwise imperceptible, discovering that the very force one fears is actually a guide toward deeper understanding of who they are and what life asks of them. Every craving, every compulsion, every impulse that pulls us towards something we cannot resist carries a message, subtle and profound, from existence itself. It is easy to dismiss these urges as meaningless or purely destructive, but in truth, they are laden with significance, if only we have the patience and awareness to perceive it. Life communicates not only through the moments of clarity and joy, but also through the turbulence of desire, through the cycles of longing and dissatisfaction that seem endless. When a person becomes willing to observe their cravings without shame or judgment, they begin to notice patterns, recurring signals that point to deeper truths about their own consciousness and about the nature of reality itself. The objects of addiction, the substances, the behaviors, the attachments, are less important than the underlying impulse, the energy that drives the mind and body toward them. This energy, raw and undiluted, is a form of language. It speaks in intensity rather than words, in repetition rather than reason. To listen to it requires stillness, a willingness to sit with discomfort, and a courage to confront what has long been avoided. In this confrontation, one discovers that cravings are not merely obstacles, but signposts. They indicate areas of unresolved tension, suppressed emotion, unmet needs, and latent potential. They mark the spaces where the individual is not fully conscious, where patterns of thought and behavior operate automatically, outside of awareness. The more one pays attention, the more one begins to see that every impulse contains a lesson, a doorway, a point of contact with something larger than the immediate self. Even the most destructive or shame-inducing behaviors reveal the structures of the psyche, the hidden dynamics that shape perception, choice, and experience. In this way, addiction, paradoxically, becomes a medium for awakening. The very force that seems to bind the individual in cycles of repetition is also the force that, if approached with insight and humility, points toward understanding, clarity, and transformation. There is a rhythm, a logic, a message encoded within every urge, and the person who learns to read this message begins to recognize the presence of intelligence behind the chaos, a communication from life that operates beneath the surface of thought, guiding those who listen toward the truths that ordinary awareness often overlooks. Struggle is often seen as something to be avoided, something painful, unnecessary, and to be overcome as quickly as possible. Yet, struggle itself carries meaning beyond the superficial experience of difficulty. When a person finds themselves repeatedly caught in cycles of tension, desire, and resistance, there is a subtle communication occurring, a dialogue between the self and existence that cannot be understood through comfort alone. Every moment of frustration, every encounter with limitation, every impulse that seems uncontrollable is not merely an obstacle, but a message, a form of teaching that is woven into the fabric of life itself. Struggle is the canvas upon which insight is painted, the pressure that reveals the contours of consciousness, otherwise hidden beneath complacency and distraction. Most people attempt to escape struggle, to numb it, to resist it, yet in doing so, they miss the guidance it offers. The intensity of struggle, the way it exposes vulnerability, the raw confrontation with the edges of one's own endurance, all of this is information, a form of divine conversation, delivered through experience rather than words. To observe struggle without denial, without immediate judgment, is to enter a space where the ordinary distinctions between pleasure and pain, success and failure, right and wrong, begin to dissolve. Within this space, the very tension that once seemed intolerable becomes a teacher, revealing patterns, tendencies, and truth that the comfortable mind could never apprehend. Addiction, desire, compulsion, these forces are often the clearest examples of struggle, and yet they are simultaneously the most eloquent messengers. They reveal what is hidden, they amplify the unconscious, they insist on attention. In yielding to awareness, rather than resisting the force, one discovers a resonance, a rhythm, a logic within the chaos, as though life itself is speaking through the struggle. The more one learns to sit with difficulty, to witness the compulsions and impulses without denial or condemnation, the more one perceives the intelligence embedded in experience, the subtle orchestration of forces guiding attention toward understanding. Struggle, in this way, is not separate from wisdom. It is the medium through which wisdom often arrives. It dismantles illusions, strips away pretense, and exposes the raw dynamics of the mind and heart. The very suffering that seems to imprison the self is also the conduit through which the self meets something larger, something unseen, something that communicates in patterns rather than words. in repetition rather than logic. Every moment of resistance, every flare of desire, every act of compulsion, when observed with clarity, becomes a mirror, a guide, a conversation with life itself. The ordinary mind struggles to grasp this, to accept that difficulty is not merely a problem to solve, but a voice, a signal, an invitation to deeper understanding. Those who listen closely begin to see that struggle is never meaningless, that resistance is never final, and that within the cycles of tension and craving lies the possibility of insight, revelation, and the awakening of consciousness. Surrender is often misunderstood as weakness, as giving up, as a failure to fight. Yet, in reality, it is one of the most profound acts of awareness a person can engage in. Resistance is the habitual response of the mind, a reflex that says, this should not be. I must control this. I must overcome this. But beneath the layers of resistance lies a quiet current of understanding, that is only revealed when one stops struggling against what is. To surrender does not mean to indulge without consciousness, nor does it mean to resign oneself to chaos. It means to observe without judgment, to recognize the patterns of desire, the pull of impulses, the compulsions that arise, and to allow them to exist as they are without immediate interference. There is a subtle distinction here. Surrender is not passivity, it is presence. It is the willingness to see what is happening in the mind and body, to feel the impulses without denial, and to recognize the energy that drives them. In this clarity arises the force of addiction, the intensity of craving, the grip of compulsion. All of these appear less threatening when they are not met with blind opposition. Resistance multiplies tension, surrender reveals insight. The mind that resists becomes trapped in a cycle of aversion and control, unable to see the larger patterns that govern behavior, while the mind that surrenders begins to perceive the underlying architecture of experience. There is intelligence in the flow of desire, a logic that is hidden when one insists on forcing outcomes or imposing strict control. By yielding attention to the present moment, by allowing impulses to surface without judgment, one begins to understand what these forces are pointing toward. Surrender opens a space in which the self is not defined by struggle, where compulsions and cravings are no longer tyrants but teachers, revealing the contours of the psyche, the hidden currents of thought and emotion, and the unspoken lessons encoded in experience. In this space, resistance loses its power, and the subtle communication from existence becomes perceptible. The impulses that once seemed unbearable begin to speak in a language that can be heard, a language that conveys insight rather than merely demand. It is in surrender that the dialogue with the self deepens, revealing the patterns of thought, the unresolved tensions, and the unmet needs that fuel compulsive behavior. To resist is to obscure these messages, to miss the opportunity to learn from what arises naturally, spontaneously, inevitably. Surrender allows one to witness the entirety of experience, to meet desire with awareness rather than judgment, to encounter compulsion with presence rather than denial. In this encounter, the very forces that seem to bind the individual become guides. The energy that once felt destructive becomes a mirror, and the act of yielding becomes a pathway to understanding. There is a rhythm, a coherence, a hidden order within the compulsions and cravings, and it is only through the practice of surrender, the willingness to see without interference, that one begins to discern this order, to hear the subtle messages embedded in the patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior, and to perceive the deeper intelligence that guides experience. Awareness of impulses is the foundation upon which true understanding of the self is built, Yet, most people move through life unaware of the subtle currents that drive their thoughts, emotions, and actions. The moment a desire arises, whether it is a craving, an attachment, or a compulsive urge, it carries information about the inner landscape that is otherwise invisible. To observe these impulses requires a kind of vigilance, a quiet attention that is neither judgmental nor reactive. Most responses to desire, the mind labels, resists, or indulges without pause, and in doing so, it misses the lesson that is embedded in the very energy of the urge. When a person cultivates awareness, when they train themselves to see each impulse clearly, without distortion, they begin to uncover patterns that were previously hidden. The intensity of craving, the subtle fluctuations of attraction and repulsion, the moments of tension and release, all of these reveal the architecture of the mind and the dynamics of consciousness. Each impulse, each moment of temptation, is a window into the unconscious, a glimpse of the forces that shape perception and behavior beyond ordinary awareness. By paying attention, by witnessing without interference, one begins to see that what once seemed chaotic and uncontrollable is in fact structured, and meaningful. Awareness transforms the experience of desire from a source of suffering into a source of insight. The compulsive act is no longer simply a reaction to an external stimulus, but a conversation with the self, a reflection of unprocessed emotion, unresolved conflict, and unmet longing. To observe impulses is to engage in a dialogue with consciousness itself, to notice the way thought arises and falls, the way sensation and emotion move in waves through the body, and the way habitual patterns repeat silently beneath the surface. In this space of observation, one begins to recognize that impulses are not enemies, but messengers, signaling the places within that require attention, understanding, and sometimes acceptance. Awareness is not passive, it requires courage, because impulses often bring discomfort, shame, or fear to the surface. To face them directly is to confront aspects of the self that have long been avoided, denied, or ignored. Yet in this confrontation, the impulses that once seemed overpowering begin to reveal their meaning, their origin, and the subtle lessons they carry. The person who cultivates awareness sees how desire interacts with thought, how craving is entwined with identity, how compulsion reflects the gaps in attention and consciousness. Through careful observation, one begins to distinguish between the energy of the impulse and the habitual reaction, between the surface of craving and the deeper intelligence it encodes. Each impulse becomes a teacher, each wave of desire a guide, each moment of tension an opportunity for insight. Awareness allows the individual to move through life with greater understanding, to act from presence rather than reaction, to recognize the intelligence embedded in experience rather than being overwhelmed by it. It is in this ongoing practice of witnessing, of noticing, of paying attention without interference that the self begins to unravel its own conditioning, perceiving the patterns, structures, and truths that were previously invisible. Awareness illuminates the invisible architecture of mind and consciousness, transforming the landscape of desire, craving, and compulsion into a map for self-understanding, insight, and awakening. Each impulse, once observed with clarity, becomes not a trap, but a portal, a subtle communication from the depths of being that points toward understanding, integration, and the hidden wisdom that exists within the rhythm of thought, emotion, and experience. Even the darkness within us can be a teacher, a guide, and a mirror. Yet most people fear it, resist it, and seek to escape from it at every turn. The parts of ourselves we label as shameful, destructive, or weak, our cravings, compulsions, addictions, and impulses carry messages that are as profound as they are hidden. They speak in a language that is not verbal, a language of energy, tension, and repetition, a rhythm that the ordinary mind often cannot interpret. Yet to ignore, deny, or suppress these darker aspects is to remain in ignorance of the full landscape of consciousness. The experiences we call dark or unacceptable are often the clearest portals into the depths of understanding. When a person looks directly into the impulses they fear or dislike, when they meet the intensity of desire without flinching, they begin to perceive patterns, structures, and lessons that are otherwise invisible. Addiction, in its many forms, is an amplification of what lies within. It makes the hidden currents of the psyche undeniable, impossible to overlook, insisting that attention be paid. The very compulsion that terrifies or shames the individual is also a form of communication, a dialogue between the self and the deeper intelligence of life. The darkness is not an enemy to be conquered. It is a mirror reflecting the neglected, the unacknowledged, and the misunderstood. To engage with it requires courage, presence, and a willingness to feel fully the discomfort that accompanies confrontation with one's own depths. It is only through such engagement that the messages encoded in desire, compulsion, and craving can be deciphered. When one stops resisting the darkness, when one ceases the habitual tendency to flee or deny, the energy of these impulses begins to reveal insight. Patterns emerge where before there seemed only chaos. Clarity arises where before there was confusion, and understanding unfolds where before there was only reaction. The mind that meets its own shadow with awareness discovers that even the most destructive behaviors carry lessons about the structures of thought, the dynamics of emotion, and the subtle forces that shape perception. Darkness, once approached without fear, becomes a teacher, revealing not only the nature of craving and compulsion, but also the intelligence that underlies the apparent disorder of experience. Each impulse, each urge, each moment of tension is a point of contact with something larger, something unseen, something that communicates through repetition, intensity, and the inevitable recurrence of desire. To observe this without judgment is to enter a dialogue with life itself, to listen to the messages embedded in the patterns of behavior, to perceive the hidden logic in what once seemed senseless. Even suffering and shame are part of this teaching, providing contrast, depth, and texture to the awareness that arises. The darkness illuminates the places where attention has been lacking, where understanding has been shallow, and where consciousness has been fragmented. By facing the shadow directly, by allowing impulses to surface and be observed without interference, the individual begins to integrate what was once denied, seeing that the very forces that seem destructive are also the most potent guides toward clarity. Insight emerges not from avoidance, but from engagement, not from suppression, but from witnessing, not from control, but from the willingness to meet reality as it is. The energy of addiction, desire, and compulsion, once acknowledged and understood, becomes a form of communication, a dialogue with the underlying intelligence that governs life, pointing toward patterns, truths, and understanding that ordinary perception rarely grasps. In this way, the darkness ceases to be a threat and becomes instead a teacher, a mirror reflecting what is hidden, a guide illuminating the pathways of consciousness, and a force that, if met with clarity and awareness, can lead to profound insight, revealing the subtle wisdom that resides within a signal of intelligence and a key to understanding the deeper nature of self and existence, demonstrating that what is feared or resisted is often precisely what is needed to illuminate the hidden architecture of mind, heart, and spirit, to uncover the messages encoded in the rhythm of experience, and to perceive the guidance, that operates beneath the surface of ordinary awareness, revealing that even in darkness there is instruction, even in compulsive repetition there is communication, and even in what appears destructive there is the subtle presence of insight, wisdom, and the possibility of profound understanding if one can simply learn to observe, receive, and discern the intelligence woven through the patterns of life.